The running back dead zone, we've talked a lot about over the last couple of years. Some of these profiles, some of the veterans that have landed in there, some of the young guys that have landed in there. So it'll be fun to kind of break down this area of drafts.
And it's always fun to go over this topic with you because you were the person who really popularized, named, explained the running back dead zone and why drafters want to stay away from it. And as I say that, I have the RotoViz Best Ball Win Rate Explorer open to 2021. We have the positional heat maps within that tool. You look at the FFPC Slim Contest, just as an example, and rounds 3 to round 6, you have this wall of red. And obviously the wall of red are those backs who are giving you negative win rates. And you go through, you look at the individual backs taken in that range. We did not have a single double-digit win rate back in that group. We did have a lot of injuries. The best win rate from that group was Javonte Williams, which you've talked a lot about as well, that if you're going to take backs in that range, you want them to be young players with upside, young players with this wider range of outcomes. And so, like you said, we're going to go into this concept in a lot more detail later in the offseason. But one of the things that you and I have talked about in our early drafts is that there always is a reaction to the really good research that does give drafters an advantage. So you have the running back dead zone out there. Over time, people start to understand how that works and how they need to adjust their draft philosophies in order to win, right? To take advantage of that information. And so one of the things that we've hypothesized is that there will be some interesting backs who fall into the dead zone, and we might want to target them, not limit ourselves. All of the good research, in all these different areas of structural drafting, we want to use it as an advantage, not as a limitation, not something where we can't go out there and get those good values. And especially best ball is so fun early. You mentioned we have the combine coming up this weekend. We expect to see some running back movement as early as drafts, that start late Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then we'll have free agency coming up. I think that some of the free agent backs look very undervalued. So Ben, start us out here. We know that this sort of round 2 through round 3 area has been very volatile in the early going. You and I are kind of looking at, what backs, count in this first, second round range, what backs count in the dead zone. I've seen people like Cam Akers and Joe Mixon go very early. I've seen them fall into the dead zone. I've seen Alvin Kamara go at the 1-2 and also fall deep into the dead zone. But we do have a group of backs sort of starting with Antonio Gibson that really do seem to be those guys that are starting the dead zone. Now Gibson kind of at that 2-3 turn, but he's someone that drafters were disappointed in last season for a variety of reasons, even though he had a pretty solid reality season. Again, who do you see here as this kind of round 3 group, and what are we looking at? Who's maybe your first target of these expensive dead zone backs?
Well, I think there's a lot there, and I think you hit on a really good point about draft trends shifting. We know that the dead zone became a really popular concept all across fantasy last year. And then once again, it was another year where it was, I guess, right to be wary of the dead zone. Some of the things we talked about, Javonte Williams was one of the main names that I highlighted as a potential target in the dead zone in my writing about it. One of the other ones was ETN, who ended up getting hurt. But this idea that a young player might be able to emerge from that range proved true. The biggest one that I kind of used as a punching bag all offseason was Mike Davis as this sort of quintessential dead zone back I kept talking about. He was older. We're projecting him for a bigger workload than he's ever had. And basically all that there was to his profile was fragility on those touches. I was actually reading back through some of the stuff I wrote about him this morning. And one of the specific comments I made was, what if another Atlanta back surprises? And it turned out to be Cordero Patterson of all people. But that was a hit as well. And so you have this thing where now there's this overconfidence, right? And so we don't want to fall into a trap there. And so I think that's a really important point. The other really important point is we are in the early off season, and you look at a guy like Mike Davis, and he was somebody who got pushed up there because of projections, because of projected workload. And that came after free agency. That came after he landed with Atlanta. There wasn't a lot of competition in that backfield. we haven't seen free agency yet this offseason. And so there probably will be some players that may not even be in the dead zone yet that will move up into the dead zone, depending on where they land. Before we started, you threw a couple names, Rashad Penny and James Conner, as candidates that could move up and land in the dead zone. I think if you can get them significantly cheaper right now, looking forward to the fact that they might eventually be dead zone backs, like, yeah, those backs tend to not be very successful, but certainly when you're getting them in the 8th or 9th round or 10th round, that's a much easier pill to swallow. Everybody has probability ranges. We're not saying just because they get drafted in that area that they aren't going to be productive in any kind of a way. And there's also like the type of back that's shifting. I mean, we're seeing David Montgomery and Josh Jacobs in the dead zone right now. I think they're really interesting in the sense that, like, I would argue a few years ago, those guys would probably be more like 3rd round picks. They're going in the 5th round in a lot of drafts. And we're also just seeing broadly in early drafts that running backs are going later. At least I'm noticing that personally, that I feel like there's a lot of drafts where people are a lot more willing, because of these dead zone trends and things, to just hammer a receiver in the 3rd round. And it pushes guys down that maybe were 3rd rounders into the 5th. And in some cases, it might push 2nd round running backs down to the 3rd. So you're asking about this 2nd, 3rd range. I mean, you mentioned Gibson, Saquon Barkley sort of in that range, Kamara. Aaron Jones goes late in the 3rd or sometimes in the 4th. I mean, even J.K. Dobbins goes a little later. And then you get into like some of the rookies. Breece Hall starts going. I think any of those names have the potential later in the offseason to be more like established 3rd rounders, early 3rd rounders. I always think of the dead zone as sort of the back half of the 3rd is sort of where it starts. But it, to me, somewhat depends on how many running backs have gone, because, you know, as these trends shift, we don't want to be saying that a player that used to go in the late 2nd, who's now going in the mid 3rd, is a dead zone back because the mid 3rd has these bad win rates when it's, you know, RB 15 or whatever, you know, whatever number it is. It's basically looked at as the same. I mean, in some respects, that could be reflective of that given year's running back crop, where we're not as confident in the RB 15 as we might have been in other years. But I think we're in a situation now with the just sort of the shifting draft trends that there's also going to be a heavy influence where RB 15 is just falling because of the last few years. The fact that not a lot of the early running backs stayed healthy or had, you know, we didn't have that legendary season last year necessarily. Taylor was the closest, but wasn't there. It's going to be a year where we're going to see some guys shift down, and it doesn't make them worse if they fall from the late 2nd, where they may have gone a different year into the late 3rd. It obviously makes them better. It makes them better values. And so it's interesting to consider those types of names. I don't know necessarily where I draw the line for like the start of the dead zone right now, but guys like Aaron Jones, I mean, we know this guy is an efficient player. We know he's had touchdown production, receiving production, can hit on all sides of the high value touch spectrum. Obviously, he has a backfield mate in A.J. Dillon, but to me, he's not the definition of a dead zone back. So he's like the type of guy, and, you know, Kamara's a tough one. We don't know about league discipline and things, but even like, Dobbins is maybe where I would start to say we're starting to get in there. I don't know. Where do you think there's this line?
Well, I would put it in this, you know, in the early 3rd. And I think that you kind of have to look at what people are thinking about with those backs. One of the things that's interesting about, you know, an Aaron Jones type of player, and you and I talk a lot about talent and how we expect that to win out, but the talent also does matter with the other people in those backfields, right? I mean, Aaron Jones goes into last season and he was valued by drafters as though Dillon was there, but that Dillon wasn't good. And that was an issue as Jones sees his EP fall from 15.7 to 13.1. And he loses 2 points per game on his workload as a rusher. And that really takes him from somebody where you have that opportunity to dominate and dictate a fantasy league to someone who really doesn't have that upside. And one of the things that we're looking at with these running backs is everybody basically comes down to, can you win your league, or should we wait for the players later? right? Because it's not that these guys are not good or that they won't score points, but you look at those dead zone results from last season, and it's like so many of those people were injured. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the win rates are low. But in addition to the injury, they didn't have the upside to winning your league anyway. And so you wanted to go with other players. I don't think that Jones has that. Now, one of the things that we do want to look at, one of the reasons why some of those guys are interesting now, is that if Dillon were to get injured, then suddenly you're looking at Jones being more of a top, 5-6 type of back, a first round back. And then that part of it is interesting. But again, it's this element where the cost to see some of those things doesn't really pay off unless you have that. One of the things that is kind of fun about last season is that the second round was so effective. I think that the thing that you mentioned there with Taylor really being the only guy is that we actually see, in some ways, I think, a bigger reaction to the first and second round running backs and how they performed. And that influences the dead zone a little bit more than how perhaps even the dead zone running backs actually do. Because all of us are not necessarily thinking, okay, well, the dead zone backs are going to carry me through, but you're thinking to yourself, well, I know the right guy to pick who's actually going to be one of these absolute league winners, in that range. But when we don't have as many of those in any given year because the first and second guys don't perform as well, then we see that really drop throughout. And so I think that we are seeing that exactly like you said. And it does create some interesting values. And some of the values you mentioned, ETN, he's an interesting guy. Dobbins is an interesting guy. Those players, as I'm putting together my running back tiers, I think that they're discounted, a full round because they were hurt last season. And so unless we were to get information suggesting that the recovery is going poorly, and that is one of the things, for example, that does happen sometimes and did start to come out. I mean, a much less important back, you could argue, straightforwardly, but also depending on where you thought Tarek Cohen was last year before all the news started to come out. But we started to get a lot of info that his recovery had some issues. And then that is what played out. But unless we were to get news like that for Dobbins or ETN, those guys should be going much, much higher. Is that where you see them? Young guys, right? And guys with ETN where you catch a bunch of passes, and Dobbins where you're playing in this elite offense. And, as you go through the fantasy season and as you're trying to set your lineups late in the year, the players that you draft early that tend to be difficult starts at the end, almost exclusively, those are guys who either got injured or they're playing in offenses that are just so bad that now every week you're trying to figure out where the points are going to come from. J.K. Dobbins is someone who, even though their size profiles are so different, he could score points in the same type of way that Derrick Henry scores points and at a much lower price.
Yeah, those two are extremely interesting. ETN to me is sort of the no-brainer target in the dead zone now, and if he stays there, will be all offseason, in the sense that when we talk about the young guys, when I've done the research on the ones that actually hit in the dead zone, my biggest takeaway is not necessarily like a rookie or a year 2 or a year 3 or what have you. It's sort of that they have not yet broken out. We have not yet seen what they are. And so the way that I think through that is the reason that they don't have the steam to get up into the second round and they wind up falling essentially into this dead zone is uncertainty of what they are as a player and people being uncomfortable with that uncertainty. And so we haven't yet seen how good they could potentially be. And for some players, that takes until like year 3. One of the guys that comes to mind a little bit is Ray Rice, who didn't do much. Maybe it was year 2 for him, but didn't do much in year 1. And then year 2, I think, was his big year. Arian Foster is a guy, didn't do much in his rookie year and started to come on late, but had the big dead zone season in his second year. It's sort of like if we didn't really get to see them play a lot in their rookie season or even in their second season, that then there is opportunity for them to finally, in a role, shine and show us something that we haven't seen yet. ETN looks like he has that potential, especially with James Robinson recovering from an Achilles injury. So he's like a pretty easy one for me to target, in addition to all the things you just said about his injury, where we already were very excited about him and drafting him in this range last year. He was a fantastic prospect, a very good receiving back. There's a lot of reasons to think that if he would have, stayed healthy or had a normal good season, you think about these young running backs trajectory. I mean, assuming that he was good, but he would be going higher this year. And so the fact that we're just kind of, obviously he didn't play, but I guess in my mind, you're already expecting him to have been a second round pick and going into year 2. And that's part of why we're drafting him in the 5th last year. And now we get him in the, the 4th and the 5th again this year. That's just great. Dobbins, little bit different in the regard that I feel like we have a little bit more of an idea of what he is. We have seen the good side of J.K. Dobbins. Part of the reason he was going in this range last year before he got hurt was some uncertainty about the offense. And you touch on it where he could potentially have like a Derrick Henry type ceiling. But there is that question of, will he catch enough passes? Will he do enough of those things? It sounds like you're very optimistic. I think you can be very optimistic. I think the upside is really like this offense is good and he can pretty, maybe not easily, but pretty comfortably, if he's the lead back and an efficient runner, score double-digit touchdowns, potentially 15 or more. And those touchdowns can make up for a lot of the lack of receiving. But I think that's the big question with him is just like, how much do the Ravens pass again? I'm thinking about that in regards to their, receiving options. They threw a lot more last year. It was very optimistic in terms of their offense sort of shifting, but will that relate back to Dobbins? When they do throw, a lot of it is deeper ADOT stuff. Jackson does have a tendency to throw downfield more or else maybe scramble and not necessarily dump off to his backs. So that's sort of where I'm at with Dobbins is I feel like we know a little bit more about him. It's kind of like Akers where you said sometimes we see Akers go up in the, the early second. He can go really high because people sort of have seen the good side of Akers. Even though he made it back this year and didn't really play particularly well in the playoffs, we've seen the good side of him. We are optimistic about the offense as well. So that's why there's people that are willing to consider him with a top 15 pick overall. I haven't seen Dobbins get that type of consideration, and I wonder if he will all offseason, if he'll be one that rises.
And one of the things for me that I like better about Dobbins, and obviously there's some projection to this, but I think that the backup situation there and the competition that he's going to have, I don't think that he's going to have a Henderson-like backup who could siphon off a number of touches. Now, the flip side is the Rams may just make the decision to have their starter play more snaps, get more touches than the Ravens want to do, shuttling guys in and out a little bit more. I think that what we've seen with J.K. Dobbins is that as a pure runner and as a run to daylight highlight runner, there probably are only 3 or 4 guys in the NFL who can match that. And especially after a season here where the Ravens took a little bit of a step back as a franchise and you're going to come out and want to prove next season. I just think they're going to want to go out and score points. I think they're going to want to play their best players. I think Dobbins as a third-year player, and obviously it was as a rookie where he was limited from a snap and from an opportunity perspective, I think that we see that change a lot going forward to where I guess I'm not that worried about other guys in the backfield. Now, if they have Ronald Jones, like we've mentioned, as seemingly a good fit, then maybe you would have a little bit more skepticism there because the guy who is almost certainly going to get the vast majority of his points as a runner, I mean, you can't then also lose some of these high value rushing attempts. So that would be a little bit of an issue.
It sounds like you're a little bit less concerned about Gus Edwards, but I'm hearing that and I'm interested in your thoughts on Dobbins versus Aaron Jones, who are going sort of in similar ranges. Jones, again, I think you may have already answered this by essentially talking about the competition. Jones has a really good back in his backfield with him in terms of A.J. Dillon, but he provides more as a receiver, assuming Aaron Rodgers is back. Let's make that assumption as well. But I think you're kind of on that train. So that's why I'm kind of asking. I'm trying to, because the idea of the run to daylight player, the efficiency and those things that we do know matters, both these guys have that.
Yeah, and even further to this idea of talent, we know that A.J. Dillon came out and put up some good peripherals last season, and you can tell that when he pushes the pile and breaks these tackles. Aaron Jones, when you look at the broken tackles and the forced missed tackles together, even better, right? I mean, he's got one of the best evasion rates in the NFL, so we know that talent is there, the big play is there, and so some of what we're looking for from Dobbins and got in flashes as a rookie, and certainly things that he put on tape as a collegiate player, One of the things here too is just that I think that you and I are willing to give the player credit for things that they did in college, especially if they flash those in limited opportunities as a rookie. To like Dobbins, you have to think he's one of the best backs in the NFL. So you've got to be willing to go out there and say that. And that's what separates him from some of these guys who come next in terms of David Montgomery and Josh Jacobs, where we have a good feel for what their profiles are going to be like. Now, that doesn't mean that if a Kenyon Drake were to come back healthy, or if David Montgomery, were to have more pressure from a receiving back, or if Herbert plays as well and takes the next step, that those guys couldn't lose some per game EP, but we kind of know what they are. We also know that the breakout to a real star type potential, to being, a first round pick, that doesn't really exist. And so those players are interesting in a completely different way. But Dobbins, if you're going to be on him, you got to go out there and make the claim that this guy is one of the best running backs in the NFL, even though we haven't seen extended spans of that at the NFL level.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And I love that we're kind of distilling it down to that skill side of it a little bit. I mean, I think you and I are people that are often thought of as, not necessarily, like, probably in this long debate or discussion about whether running back skill matters, of being on the other side of it, of being a little bit more concerned about, things like EP, like you was referencing, or I was referencing, high value touches, what their actual role is, what their real ceiling looks like when you get into the numbers and you say, can he be a 25 point per game type of back? But at a certain point, the skill stuff does matter. And anyway, I love that take. I mean, you're making a point. I've heard you mention that before in past years, before Dobbins got hurt, that you felt really good about his talent. And there's a lot of people that want to say that player talent doesn't matter. Well, I mean, it certainly matters at receiver. And then especially running back is where you get that discussion. And I mean, the fact is that, I just want to emphasize, even Shawn Siegele has his player talent takes, and sometimes more than others. But let's get into the little bit more into the deeper part of the dead zone. We talked about Montgomery, Jacobs. Ezekiel Elliott is going there. To me, he's a back that I don't want anything to do with. I've heard a lot this offseason already that they're going to play them, the contract, this, that, the other thing. I completely reject that idea. I mean, a lot of people are referencing 2021. Look, they kept playing him. Everybody wanted them to play Pollard. They weren't playing Pollard. In my mind, the contract stuff matters a ton, in the sense that they were not going to be able to get out of Zeke's contract this offseason. It has a ton of dead money. They are able to after this year. It changes, and almost certainly will after this year. And so when you're in 2021 and you have a whole nother offseason ahead of you and a whole nother season ahead of you, that you're stuck with this player, and stuck in air quotes. Yes, he was injured. Maybe you have a different opinion on him, but just assume that they didn't want to necessarily be playing him. It's tough to then bench him, because you're already going into the whole next offseason with this idea of this player that has an albatross contract that you don't even like. If you're at least playing him, there are a lot of things that can happen. Some of those things could include him actually playing better and playing well enough that you could consider trying to get some type of a trade done in the offseason, even though this is a massive contract. But we saw things like David Johnson get moved. It would have been pretty crazy for the Cowboys to have made the decision in the 2021 season to be basically done with Elliott a year and a half before they can get out of the deal. That changes in 2022. And I'm not saying it's going to change in week one. I don't think it will change in week one. I think they're going to give Elliott all the opportunity in the world, because the contract does matter and they do like him in the building and all those things. I think they're going to give him all the opportunity in the world to be healthy and be good starting in 2022. My question is, in week 8, week 9, week 10, what happened in 2021 where they were not willing to just let Tony Pollard do more? Will that happen again in 2022? Or will they, at that point in 2022, where they know, look, we're not trading Elliott. He's on our roster. He's a sunk cost at this point. And after the season, we can cut him and basically be gone. I think there's more of a risk in 2022. I don't think 2021 is going to be perfectly predictive of the same decisions and the same things that they're going to need to be considering. So I do see his workload, that people are taking him in this range largely because, look, he's going to get these touches. That's what I keep hearing. He's going to be Dallas's back. We've seen this for years. This is the year where that could actually change, in my opinion.
Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.